This video was brought to you by Nebula. On Monday, the United Nations hosted the first round of talks between Libya's eastern and western governments to try and resolve an escalating crisis over who gets to control the country's central bank. These talks come nearly a month after an armed group, apparently loyal to the Western Tripoli-based administration, forced out longtime central bank governor Sadiq Kabir, who was supported by the Eastern Benghazi-based administration. In response, the Eastern-backed administration, which controls most of the country's hydrocarbon reserves, has suspended oil production, sparking an economic crisis and threatening to plunge the country into a third civil war. So in this video, we're going to look at how Libya got to this point, why this is terrible news for its already frail economy, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, to understand this story, you need to know a bit about Libya's weird post-conflict governance structure. From 1969 to 2011, Libya was run by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, but after the Arab Spring, he was captured and killed by NATO-backed rebels in October 2011. Originally, it looked like Libya was on its way to become a democracy. A parliament was set up in the capital of Tripoli, and elections were held in December 2012. However, the security situation in the country rapidly deteriorated, and in January 2014, the Libyan parliament said that they were unable to hold fresh elections. A few months later, an army general from the country's east called Khalifa Belkacem Haftar decided that he'd had enough and staged a military coup with what he called the Libyan National Army. This kicked off what's known as the Second Libyan War, which lasted until a ceasefire in 2020. Obviously, what happened in these 6 years between 2014 and 2020 is immensely complicated. But the TLDR is that the UN-recognized government, today known as the Government of National Accord, kept control over western Libya and are now based out of Tripoli, while Haftar and the LNA maintained control over the east and are now based out of Benghazi, Libya's second biggest city. Now, this 2020 ceasefire was agreed after a failed LNA offensive towards Tripoli in 2019, which stalled after Turkey stepped in to support the Government of National Accord, or GNA. Now, there were plans to hold new elections in 2021, but this collapsed after neither side was willing to risk their grip on power, and elections haven't been held since, leaving Libya as sort of two separate countries. In many ways, Haftar and the LNA are in a stronger position than the GNA today. They control more territory than the GNA, as well as most of the country's oil fields. For context, Libya has roughly 50 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the most in Africa and in the top 10 around the entire world. It's hard to imagine today, but Libya's vast oil wealth actually meant that it had a higher GDP per capita than both the EU and the US in the 70s. However, one thing that Haftar and the LNA don't control is the central bank, which is based out of Tripoli. Now, this might sound unimportant. After all, not all military governments are that into monetary policy. But if you want to export Libyan quantities of oil, you need an internationally recognized central bank to process the payments, especially because the UN Security Council has passed a series of resolutions which essentially mean that the central bank is the only non-sanctioned depository for state oil revenues. The central bank also controls basically all banking services inside Libya because it owns two big commercial banks in the country and holds roughly $30 billion in reserves. This has made the central bank, along with the National Oil Corporation, basically the only institution to survive the Arab Spring and to bridge the divide between East and West. Anyway, for most of the past decade or so, it was the Eastern government who would complain that the central bank wasn't giving them enough money. So, in order to get around this, the Eastern government tried to set up their own central bank in the eastern city of Baida, but this didn't really work, and the two central banks were reunified last year. However, since then, the tables have turned, and it's actually the UN-backed Western government that's taken issue with the central bank. This is because the Prime Minister in the West, Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh, and the Governor of the Central Bank, Sadiq Kabir, blame one another for Libya's economic woes. And because Dbeibeh worries that Kabir, who's been in post since 2011, is becoming too personally powerful. Kabir has also been trying to negotiate a unified budget agreed to by both the East and West, largely to convince the Eastern government to stop literally printing counterfeit money and stoking inflation. But Dbeibeh and his allies accuse Kabir of secretly giving the Eastern government more funds to keep them on side. For the past few months, Dbeibeh has been trying to oust Kabir, but Kabir has resisted. Things came to a head in early August when a group of armed men laid siege to the bank, kidnapped senior officials, and announced that Kabir had been replaced. Kabir then described the situation as unconstitutional and fled. In response, the Eastern administration, who are a lot friendlier with Kabir, said it was suspending the production and export of all Libyan oil until Kabir was reinstated. For context, oil accounts for about 60% of GDP and about 98% of government revenues, which in turn pay the salaries of some 3 million civil servants, accounting for about 40% of the entire population. If production doesn't restart soon then, the economy will collapse, especially because banking services have been suspended since Kabir's departure. Now, you might think that the obvious thing to do here would be for Dbeibeh to reinstate Kabir, but he'll be very reluctant to do this. Not just because of their ongoing power struggle, but also because bowing to pressure from the East would tip the balance of power further in Haftar's direction. Haftar already controls more territory and resources than Dbeibeh, but increased support from the central bank means that he now also has access to reliable funding, which has sparked an economic boom in the East. Apparently emboldened by his newfound financial power, Haftar has started quietly putting pressure on Dbeibeh, and there are even reports that he's privately planning another assault on Tripoli sometime in the near future, which would explain the military hardware currently flowing into eastern Libya. In May, for instance, the US asked the Tunisian president to explain a highly unusual rotation of Russian military flights into and out of southern Tunisia, presumably carrying Russian weapons for Haftar. And in July, Italy intercepted a shipment of Chinese combat drones on their way to Benghazi. While Turkey's continued presence in western Libya should deter any escalation in the immediate future, Dbeibeh will nonetheless be wary of giving any further concessions to Haftar at a time when tensions are already on the rise. Before we go, we have a special announcement which I'd love you to watch. Look, as British people, we often cast a wary eye at our friends across the Atlantic. But honestly, the last few months have been especially wild. We've seen Biden bail from the race after a terrible debate.
My fellow Americans.
The red-blue divide making way for lurid green. Trump accusing Kamala of changing her race. Vance getting accused of couches. Endless memes about coconut trees, and endless arguments over crowd sizes.
This weird obsession with crowd sizes.
Obama making a joke, Trump talking about Biden like an ex he misses, RFK Jr. potentially having worms in his brain, before admitting to burying a bear in Central Park. Oh, and an assassination attempt that we all kind of forgot about because of all of the other chaos. I mean, honestly, WTF USA. The thing is though, while it might be tempting to just roll your eyes at these shenanigans, these aren't just meme-worthy moments. And you know I'm serious, because I've not stood up in a video since COVID. But these incidents actually pose important questions, like how much does the Gen Z vote matter this time round? How important will online campaigning and social media prove to be? What impact do running mates have? Okay, I don't have words for that one. These are the kinds of things we'll be explaining in our new Nebula original series, What to Follow USA, only on Nebula. Each week, we'll take the moments that have been dominating internet discourse and explaining the true politics under the hood. Look at me pandering to the American audience. We'll be releasing new episodes of What to Follow every Friday through to the election. The fact that it's on Nebula means we've been able to take more risks with this series. The tone and attitude of the show isn't what you'd expect from TLDR. I'm not sure we've talked about fucking couches on YouTube before, but the journalism and reporting is exactly the standard you'd expect. Nebula support also means that we can do things differently, create additional content for you, and tackle topics that the YouTube algorithm just wouldn't normally allow for. It's not just this new series on Nebula either though. There's also incredible originals on the platform like Modern Conflicts from Real Life Law, or the upcoming documentary from Tom Nicholas, Boomers, which takes a provocative look at the lives and legacy of the baby boom generation. Plus, we also post all of our normal content on Nebula ad-free, and often before it ends up on YouTube. If you want to check all of that out, plus WTF USA, then head to go.nebula.tv/WTF, or click the link in the description. That way, you can pick up an annual Nebula subscription for a huge 40% off. We're really happy with how this new series has turned out, so please do give the series a look. We'd really appreciate it.